Welcome to the Dawn to Dusk podcast with your host, Douglas Wood, author of From Dawn to Dusk, How to Build a Multi-Million-Dollar Law Practice and Then Give It Away. In each episode, Doug speaks with distinguished legal professionals who have mastered the intricacies of building a successful law practice and then transitioning to retirement or other fulfilling pursuits when the right time comes. Now, let's join Doug for today's insightful discussion.
Welcome to the Dawn to Dusk podcast. I'm your host, Doug Wood. My guest today is Dan Jaffe, the longtime leader of the Association of National Advertisers Washington office and one of the advertising industry's most influential and respected advocates. Before joining the ANA in 1985, Dan spent 11 years on Capitol Hill, serving in both the U.S. House and Senate, including as staff director of the Senate Commerce Committee's Consumer Subcommittee, and later as committee counsel to the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. In those roles, he helped shape major consumer protection and commerce policies before transitioning into the industry leadership, where for decades he played a central role in strengthening First Amendment protections for advertising and advancing modern frameworks for privacy and self-regulation. Following his storied run at the ANA, Dan entered a new chapter, one focused on helping leaders navigate an increasingly complex regulatory environment. He continues to consult on privacy issues, including the emerging and profound privacy implications of AI, an area where he sees intense activity as states rush to fill regulatory gaps. He is also closely following the potential Supreme Court review of unitary executive theory as applied to so-called independent regulatory agencies, a development Dan believes could fundamentally reshape how we view institutions like the FTC and the FCC, and that will have wide-ranging implications for advertisers, media platforms, and consumers. Dan holds a BA from Colorado College, a master's from Princeton University's School for Public and International Affairs, and a JD from UC Berkeley. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Doug. Glad to be here.
So, we've known each other for decades. I had the privilege of working with you when I was general counsel of ANA, and you were the main lobbyist for the industry down there in the lovely little Washington, D.C. And we always had great fun in doing very complex things. We've somehow found a way to lighten the moments, even in the most serious situations. But what I'd like to start out, though, is take us back to the beginning. What your early decisions you made that shaped your trajectory from Colorado College to Princeton's, and then ultimately what motivated you to go to law school.
So I've always been interested in government work. That was always a goal of mine to get involved in that. I went to the Woodrow Wilson School at that time, now the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton, and got my master's degree. I then got a law degree, as you said, at UC Berkeley. And my goal was always to work in government. I, for a very short time, worked for a public relations firm, a political public relations firm, and then I went up on the Hill and worked for 11 years. As part of that effort, I worked on the appropriations side first, and then I worked on the Senate Commerce Committee. Was always my interest in the First Amendment. And as you said, I was the head of the Consumer Subcommittee staff, and we dealt with overseeing the FTC and helped to oversee the FCC as well. And we dealt with real world First Amendment issues there. So when an opening came in the advertising area, I was very interested in taking that. And by the way, I learned about that job from a Republican staffer, which is maybe something relevant to talk about later, which is that the Republicans and Democrats actually, some of the time worked together, and he had gone and talked to them, decide he didn't want it, but thought it might be something I'd be interested in, came to me. So that's how I got into the advertising world.
So you were on the Hill in some real crazy days of the FTC when there was undergoing fundamental changes in leadership and philosophy. What was that like?
So people just don't remember any of this anymore, but Mike Perchuk was the chairman of the Federal Trade Commission. While he was chairman, he had 17 rulemakings going on simultaneously, from automobiles to dental work, but the one that most people focused on was a total ban on children's advertising. The Congress shut him down, shut the whole FTC down as far as any kind of rulemaking. They took away all of the funding that was going on. And so this was, a very significant situation right there. And then Reagan became president, and his direction was deregulation rather than regulation. And so there was really a sea change as to how the FTC was operating.
We watched it go from a go-go heavy-duty Federal Trade Commission to a paper tiger Federal Trade Commission almost overnight. It was quite a change in those days. But the fight against First Amendment protection of commercial speech went on, and it didn't abate simply because the FTC had walked away from its rulemaking authority in terms of children's advertising. But so you were riding high and well and significant on the Hill. But what was it what was the motivation to leave government and go into the private sector?
So, as I said, I was very interested in the whole area of First Amendment activity, and the advertising area actually happened to be on the cutting edge of that, as we can discuss in a little bit more detail. And I thought that working in the advertising area would be, really interesting. And beyond that, I just always found advertising really interesting because it moves with society. It's constantly responding to all of the changes that are taking place, or at least it certainly, if it's going to be effective, has to try to do that. And so I thought this would be a really interesting area, and it proved to be. I was never bored in working on this. It was not the same thing over and over and over again. There was constant change and constant new issues that were coming up. And so it was a real challenge.
So you leave the Hill, you go to the ANA, all ready to take on First Amendment issues, and you're faced with the Florida tax issue. Quite apart from advertising, marketing, First Amendment issues. Take us through that process. What was it about, and how you ultimately defeated it?
Okay, I'll go back to the First Amendment issue in a little while, because I think it's important to remind people of where we really stood.
Oh, we're going to get to that. Don't
First
worry.
Amendment. But in regard to Florida, this was by far the largest state tax on advertising up to that time, and has been the largest tax since then. And what it did was it took their sales tax and applied it, which in the sales tax was a 5% sales tax on all advertising seen in the state. And this was going to cost our industry hundreds of millions of dollars. And they claimed at the time when they did this that they needed to do that because Florida was the fastest growing state in the country. And they also argued when we said, hey, we'll move our advertising elsewhere, that advertising is very mobile. They said, oh, you can't do that. You just can't leave a marketplace that's so large and so growing. Well, they proved out to be completely wrong. The industry as a whole responded extremely strongly. So within a very short period of time, all of their media markets lost 11 to 18% of their dollars. That was just in several months. At the same time, hundreds of thousands of room nights were lost because of the fact that many organizations, including ours, pulled our conventions or meetings out of Florida. And this created so much heat that they backed off after 6 months. One other thing that I should mention is that both the newspapers and the television industry gave free time for anti-Florida ads to be run. And so that was another thing that caused heat. The governor lost his job shortly thereafter, and most of the people who were pushing this legislation lost their job. This actually showed the power of the advertising community for the first time in its full glory, I guess is the way to describe it. And this actually helped us for a number of years because a lot of the states were concerned to take us on after that.
One of the things I thought was very fascinating in terms of the battle you led against that was how you put together a really interesting coalition of people to fight together with the media, the advertisers, the convention organizers, you name it, across the board. And then you did something that I thought was really significant in terms of the beginning of your ongoing sales tax battles. Is you commissioned a Nobel laureate to write a study on the impact of advertising on individual legislative districts, so that those who were going to vote against advertising would see the local impact on it. What prompted you to think that was like a major, brilliant move? What prompted you to take that direction?
So, uh, what was happening at that time was that a lot of economists had been arguing. John Kenneth Galbraith, uh, Vance Packer, and others had been basically arguing that advertising was not valuable, that all it did is it moved demand from one similar product to another, that it didn't do anything that was very effective. We felt that was undermining the protection that advertising deserved. And we got two economists, two Nobel laureates, Kenneth Arrow and George Stigler. And interestingly enough, one was very much a key economist depended on by the Democrats, and one was a key economist depended on by the Republicans. And they put together a joint study that was the most definitive study to that time, showing the enormous impact that advertising had on the economy and GDP. And as you point, we then broke it down by congressional district, so that this actually showed people from place to place to place the impact. One of my fears when we did that study was that we would find that, yes, it was very powerful in places like New York or Florida, Illinois, but that in places like Montana, Alaska, et cetera, would not show those numbers. That didn't turn out to be the case. That in every state and every congressional district, advertising was one of the most important drivers of business.
I think the offshoot of that study, as you and I have talked about over the years, was really to change the perception of the impact of advertising on the economy. That it was, generally just like a whipping post, and nobody, they had the attitude that it didn't do anything really. That proved it to be the opposite. And I think that legacy of that study that you led has had an impact for decades on the respect that these kind of investments in advertising have.
Excuse me, Doug, but what they found was that for each dollar spent on advertising, there was an enormous multiplier throughout the economy, and that it had, extraordinary impacts on job creation. And the industry itself didn't have that data and didn't fully understand this data until we pulled that study together. So it was very important internally as well as externally to give people, much more sense of the value of what we were doing.
Well, I think you in particular, since you led that whole initiative, deserve great credit in making that fundamental change to the perception of advertising, and is a great lesson for anyone who is going to be in business, that, perseverance and leadership like yours is the way you make a difference. Let me take a quantum leap backwards and then forwards again, and get back to the First Amendment, which I know is near and dear to you, and you've worked with constitutional scholars, and you've worked with all sorts of folks on First Amendment issues. Had some successes, we had some setbacks over the years. Where do you see it going today?
So let me back up a little bit and then talk about the future. When I got started in this whole process, advertising was not considered to have First Amendment protection. Crescent v. Valentine had found in 1942 that advertising, if it was pure advertising, was not protected by the First Amendment. And it was really not until Bigelow and Virginia Pharmacy and finally Central Hudson that we got a clear statement that advertising, not only if it was truthful, was highly protected by the First Amendment, but that it was extremely valuable. That was fragile at the time, because in 1986, in the Posadas case, as you probably remember, the Chief Justice found that advertising directed to people in Puerto Rico could be banned, but not to tourists. They backed off against that in cases very shortly thereafter in Rubin and Liquor Mart cases. And we have continued to win without fail in all of the First Amendment challenges that we've had before the Supreme Court. But a number of them have been 5-4 decisions. And so it is, anybody who takes this for granted is wrong. I actually think right at the moment we're in a pretty strong place, because both some of the liberals and some of the conservatives feel very strongly in favor of First Amendment protection of advertising. But it's certainly not something that you can take for granted. And so we got to always respond to any of these cases when they come up. And what the Association of National Advertisers did, and other groups always did, is have top lawyers, top First Amendment scholars weigh in either directly or in front of the court cases. I'm very pleased that we have 1,000% batting record so far, and after we got the thing in place. But if there were changes in the court, that could change very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, that is, I think the successes you had over the years on First Amendment issues on advertising speak volumes on how properly couched arguments are going to be persuasive to the court, regardless of whether they're conservative or liberal, because there's a commonality in the issues that are there. Many of the issues today are different that go before the court that are not quite as, universal, but that's a discussion for another day. But what you also were very involved in over the years was all the consumer privacy issues and everything, associated with that, which is another, massive issue that when you started out at the ANA was kind of, not a big deal. It was just kind of a thought in the side. It has now become essential to so much of what we face today. And we've gone through lots of it together in the issues that we addressed when we were working with one another. But the new one now, which is really mind-boggling to me and to so many, is what will AI do with respect to these issues, consumer protection and privacy? Where do you see that going? Because I know you consult today on those issues.
All right. So let me just say a couple of words about privacy in general. When I first got started, that was not an issue at all. Nobody discussed it at all. In about 1991, there was an annual meeting where I got our president to agree to have somebody speak about advertising on the internet. And this got tremendous blowback as to why were we wasting our time when advertising on the internet was hardly being spent at all. It had nothing to do with, they were spending vastly more on outdoor advertising and certainly vastly more on newspapers and magazines and television. Why were we wasting our time? Well, obviously things can move very, very fast. The internet is now an enormous area for advertising. And privacy has become ever more concerned when there have been breaches and when people feel that their data is being taken and that they're being targeted and manipulated. This is only going to be dramatically increased, in my view, because of AI, because its demands on data. I mean, that is what AI is really. It has an insatiable desire for data so that it can use the tremendous ability of computers to really be able to get better decisions. And so there's going to be a real potential fight here. A number of states have put in various types of restrictions on AI. The president just a week or so ago put out an executive order saying that there should be no state regulation of AI and that he will have the government sue the states that have AI regulations to try to have those regulations removed. And that on top of that, that he will be pulling money, federal money, out of states that have AI protection. On the other hand, the European Union is about to roll out in 2026 very, very, very stringent restrictions on AI that will certainly affect all those who do business in the EU. And so the pressures are going to really build up there. And the whole question about social media and the manipulation of kids, all of this is going to be, I believe, even further increased because of AI and the ability of AI to create pictures of people that look real, voices of people that look real. All of this is going to create even greater concerns about deception. So I think this is going to be a really major battleground, and that anybody who's an advertising lawyer needs to first get to be very knowledgeable about privacy issues in general, and then to bring themselves up to speed on where AI is going to further exacerbate these issues.
You mentioned the AI's ability to be used in myriad different ways, and there's a big movement today of concern over how AI is impacting children and how they're putting it in programs on toys and all sorts of things. I saw that and it harkened back to the days of, well, there should be a ban on advertising to children. And it also sort of brought up the whole thing that's going on in Australia now, where they're banning social media to anyone under 16, I believe it is. And there's a lot of movement in Europe as well. We tend to, as the United States, tends to give more freedom to creativity and these kinds of things than other countries do. But are we at an inflection point where, given what AI is doing to potentially influence children and the First Amendment issues that relate to what one can do in that respect, are we coming to a crossroads here?
So I am certain that in 2026, there's going to be a big battle over the whole question of whether the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act should be amended and changed and so-called strengthened, whether COSA, Children's Online Safety Act, is going to be acted on. I believe that there's going to be no question that children's issues are going to be very much on the forefront in the next Congress, and that privacy as part of that is going to be a very important issue.
And so, where would you see the First Amendment implications in that dialogue?
Well, it's interesting because if you don't allow kids to see social media until they're 16 years old, this raises all sorts of interesting questions. In a number of states, people can get married before they're 16 years old. So I guess you're smart enough to get married, but you're not smart enough to get social media. I'm not sure that kind of argument is going to be persuasive, but I just think it starts raising questions about what kind of information people can have. And the assumption when you say that kids can't see any social media is that social media is pernicious across the board, which I think is far from clear cut. So there are First Amendment issues there that are going to have to be hashed out.
Well, it harkens back for me to the days when the government, the FTC in particular, was criticized for becoming a national nanny when it was trying to replace the role of parents with its role of government regulation. That's something that's always been resisted here in the States, not so much in Europe or in Australia, obviously. And the AI aspect of this and the whole social media application with phones and all the rest of the stuff that kids have nowadays is really harkening back to that conflict between parental authority and government authority, which has always been a hotbed in the United States.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you've summed it up. I mean, this is an issue that has not been resolved, that is really splits parties. There are very conservative and liberals on both sides on each party in regard to these issues. And so I don't know how this is going to come out. All I know is it is important that the advertising community be aware of what this is, suggests. I mean, if you can say that kids can't see social media until they're 16 years old, does that suggest that you should be able to start banning various types of advertising until kids are 16 years old? Right now, it's 12 and under is how we treat people as children, but there's what I would call child creep. That who is going to be treated as a helpless child is getting to be considered an older and older age. I think that raises, as we've already discussed, some very significant issues.
That brings up the issue you and I have discussed over the years when it comes to First Amendment protection, and most people not being particularly familiar with the ramifications of it, or whatever, the so-called slippery slope, where you have a great idea. We've got to do something about AI's influence on children. We're going to not let kids under 16 or whatever might be the solution. And what is missed is, well, what is the next piece of that? Where does that flow to? And how is it going to impact what would otherwise be perfectly legitimate activities? And that's the fear of the First Amendment implications when you start to regulate, right?
Exactly. And our experience has been that always there are people who have some specific area that they are concerned about. When I first got started, it was tobacco, and then it was alcohol, and then it was ATVs, then it was movies that were considered to be too sexual. Once you get that, start going down there is a slippery slope here. And there will always be people who will say, well, oh, if we did it here, now we should do it here, here, and here. And so we should be very, very careful about what we allow to happen in this area without certainly raising the right issues.
It's interesting because often I'll get into a debate with folks who will say something like, well, look at what they're doing in Europe, look at what they're doing in Australia, look at what they're doing elsewhere. And I always remind them, well, those are places that don't have First Amendments. That's the difference between it. And it comes with some bad stuff, but it also comes with some very good stuff that is not a privilege you have outside this country. But that's, again, another discussion for another day.
Right. But again, it's things that people don't, people have been trying to ban prescription drug advertising. It affects just a very wide range of products and categories that people may not automatically have thought of. When they were talking about tobacco, they weren't. I would talk to the prescription drug companies and say, hey, watch out. If this restriction is put in place, it's likely that they're going to come to you. And they said, nonsense. We're health companies. We're not causing health risks.
Right.
That proved to be false.
So
we won so far in the battle, but nonetheless, they certainly were under attack.
So one of the focuses of this podcast from Dawn to Dusk is that point in one's career where you decide, I'm going to move on, and I'm going to transition into something else, or not necessarily retire, but to do something else in the environment. Now, at some point, you came to that decision when you were running the Washington office of A&A, had been there a long time, had been storied in so many different ways and admired by everybody, in the industry. What made you decide that, you know what, I'm going to go now. I'm going to do something else. Take us through that.
So I was fortunate. I never got bored with what I was doing. I mean, one of the reasons that people should try to do something else is if they feel they're stagnating. I didn't feel that really, but I did feel more strongly than I had ever felt before that we had put together a team in our Washington office that was very strong and that had the trust of our leadership in New York, and that had trust of our board, and that while I'd had a very long career, an enjoyable career, that this might be a good time to step out. Well, I would be able to be certain that the things that I had been trying to do would continue. So that was useful. Also, I had other options. So that was something that I very much wanted. I didn't want to just retire and play golf.
Well, did you ever play golf?
Barely.
Oh, barely? Well, I made the mistake.
Some people would question it.
I made the mistake of taking it up for the first time when I was 70 years old. And that was probably the biggest mistake I made because I fell in love with it. And now I just go out and stink every weekend playing golf. But whatever, that's another
I'm
story.
a tennis player, but anyway.
Oh, there you go. Okay, yeah, there you go. You can play golf a lot longer than you can play tennis, though. So
I understand.
Your knees will eventually go. And although now the thing is what? Pickleball, right? Now we're all supposed to play pickleball, which I think is a totally insane game. But that's another story. But so with careers as long and storied as yours, over the course of your career, you obviously would have to shift your positions based on, because you were a lobbyist in Washington, shift your positions based on the political winds. You had to, deal with colleagues and others in the marketplace that were at cross purposes to you. Those are moments that lawyers in their careers often have to face. Take us through how you navigated those rough waters over all those years.
So, and this is a problem that has developed. I always found that I could talk to people, and at least early in my career, and get a reasonable hearing, and that people weren't so much in cement or were so tribal in their views, that they were open not to being persuaded, which is the key. That's all I had ever asked, is that I be able to get in and make our arguments. Obviously, we can't control what the Congress will finally do, but I wanted to make sure that when they did whatever they did it knowledgeably. I had certainly learned that when I was up on the Hill, that I thought I knew stuff, and then lobbyists would come in and tell me stuff that would educate me as to the fact that things were much more complicated than I understood. But I was always free to be able to make my own judgments and give that information onto the people who I was working for. So I just think it's very important to try and lay things out in as clear a way as possible, try to be as civil in laying this out as possible, and depend on the ability of others to see your points of view if you make the arguments effectively. I'm concerned, as I just mentioned, that to some extent I think people are becoming somewhat deaf because they take a position and then they feel they have to die on a hill over it, and I just think that's very unfortunate.
So what would your advice be to somebody who is trying to do those battles on the Hill today to try to get through it all?
So what I always tried to do, and I found it to be useful, is I tried to predict where things were. It's a little bit like Gretzky was talking about in hockey, that it's not where the puck is now, it's where it's going to be. Is trying to figure out what's coming up, what are going to be the issues, try to develop, the information and the facts, and reaching out to the industry itself to get this information in place so that when the real fight happens, we're not scrambling. I find that when in the situations where we've had to scramble, we've not done as well. And so trying to think this out, and this is also for lawyers, representing clients, is to try and figure out what's going to be their problem and try to figure out what can be the possible answers, even maybe before they start asking you and paying you, just so that you are in position to be able to move quickly when it matters and be able to move most effectively.
You're almost describing what I would say is one of those three-dimensional chess games, where you've got to think many moves ahead before you start to make your individual moves. But that's complicated today, very complicated today, obviously.
Well, it is. That's one point, which is in the Florida ad tax, I ran around and a bunch of others ran around to all of the companies and said, this ad tax is going to pass. And they said, nonsense. We've had lots of these proposals out there. They've never gone anywhere. This isn't going to go anywhere either. Then it happened. Then we were really digging out of a big hole. And it's so much harder to remove something once it's in place than stopping it from getting in place and getting into concrete. So I really urge people to try to think ahead. It's not always possible. I certainly have been surprised by things, even if I'm trying to think ahead. But if you don't think ahead, you're going to be surprised all the time.
It reminds me of the adage that the greatest victory is the ones that nobody really sees, as opposed to the ones that people have to publicly battle over because they weren't prepared for the consequences in the first place. And that's what you did so brilliantly in all your years at the ANA. One of to conclude this, this show is very much about legacy. And I don't mean to be morbid or anything like that, because there's plenty of time left for all of us. But it is about legacy. And so of all the work you've done in government, and it's been a myriad of work, in industry, the advocacy, all the rest of it, what parts of it do you hope really endure?
So I worked on a whole range of issues when I was up on the Hill. The Toxic Substances Control Act, the Airbag Act, appliance and car labeling. One thing I was very proud of was we got funding for the 1892 so-called Black land-grant colleges, which after Plessy v. Ferguson grew up because there had to be separate but equal education. So all these Black colleges were not being funded, and we got that to be funded. So I'm very hopeful that will continue. In the advertising area, I am, as I said, I hope the legacy in regard to First Amendment and the economic values of advertising are maintained and continue. And also, we didn't talk about, but is very important, the whole self-regulatory effort of the advertising community, both for children and for adults and for privacy. And I think it's very important that the industry continue to put its best foot forward on these things. That really helps when we go in and talk to legislators.
So let's just talk a little bit about self-regulation for a moment, because I know you and I went through that process for many years, and the impact of self-regulation was significant in terms of the way it impacted advertising content and what we saw. Do you see that as still a very powerful element within the industry?
I think it's still a powerful element. I don't know whether the industry feels as positive about it as it once did. I know for a fact that the FTC said that the advertising self-regulatory policies were the strongest of any industry. And that certainly helped us when we went in to talk to people, because we were saying, hey, we're not fighting you. We believe that there should be truthful and non-deceptive advertising. True. We've got the self-regulatory programs to see that. We believe that you shouldn't take advantage of people in regard to their privacy concerns. And that's why we've set up various ways to provide protection for the public. That's always helped. But that only works if industry is actually very active on this. And just like we've been discussing before, self-regulation has to develop as we go forward and as new issues come up. And it only works if industry actually participates. And I guess the one message I would really like to get across to people is the biggest problems I ever had in regard to my government work, and the closest I ever came to losing issues, was when somebody in industry had really done something and stepped way out of bounds, and that had become public. And then that created just outrage in the government. And then it was just very, very hard to go in and say, oh, well, we're okay. That was just a strange thing that just happened there, but that's not how it really works generally. It's very hard and this is where lawyers can make a difference inside companies, to say, be careful what you do and what you say. And when you say something, mean it.
Yeah, it's like the adage, bad facts make bad laws. We've seen the knee-jerk reaction all too often, where some isolated occurrence happens, and then the legislatures go off the deep end to try to address it when they're really throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Hopefully, you can prevent that from becoming epidemic. But let me conclude though with another question on this area. Where do you see self-regulation and AI intersecting?
So I think that people need to look at some of the legislation that has come out there and look at what the EU is doing. China is moving in that direction as well. The OECD is moving in this direction. And from that, I think we can figure out things that we can do that are positive. The group that I work for has something called Privacy for America, that put together a proposal that was dealing with privacy issues in general, that we thought would actually provide strong protection to the public, while also allowing advertising to go forward and be able to target, with the ability for consumers to opt out where appropriate. We need to extend that same outlook to AI, and that's in fact what I am now working on with our organization, to figure out what changes, if any, need to be done. One of the things about AI that makes it particularly complicated is you got to get it right from the outset, because once it gets rolling, and it may be self-generating, and so people are not necessarily regulating on every step of the way the systems and the algorithms themselves are operating. It becomes very, very hard to clean things up if things go wrong, and also becomes a massive repository of data. And so the whole question of hacking and the problem of people getting all of this data from these various sources increases. So I think this is something that industry really needs to spend some money, time, and internal analysis, and soon.
My fear, Dan, is that because AI can generate so many anecdotal horror stories. Almost every day you're reading one or the other. It's higher volume of those kinds of motivators for legislators to react in a knee-jerk reaction that I wonder whether or not, I'm curious on your observation on this, I wonder whether or not self-regulation or legislative regulation can keep up with AI.
So I don't know the answer to that. What I do know is even if there is eventually legislation or even legislation that we don't like, that if you've had a self-regulatory system that's strong, that often creates parameters within which the legislators and the industry can talk to each other in a reasoned way. So I think self-regulation efforts, or at least thinking out how you would self-regulate, will be very profound in regard to how you would actually respond to any particular legislation that's going to come forward. And already, they have spoofed politicians and had, politicians supposedly taking positions, with things that are quite realistic. And that's only going to get stronger and stronger. So that's going to scare the political types a great deal. And so that's, I see this as something that is unavoidable. We have to figure out how to live with this. It has tremendous advantages, can really improve the ability to think through issues through or to target. But it has some real downsides as well if it's not controlled.
Well, let's hope that it does get controlled. And I want to end the podcast on a positive note rather than the negative note of AI and the doomsday scenarios so many people put out there. But I'm always reminded whenever I have the chance to talk to you about all the many battles that you won for the industry, whether it was taxes, First Amendment, privacy. I mean, your track record is beyond Hall of Fame. And it's something I know I was very proud to have worked with you on some of those issues. And I just like to thank you for all the stuff you did in the industry and continue to do in a different way. And to just thank you for being on the show.
Thank you. Nothing that I accomplished was possible without tremendous help from all sorts of people within companies, lawyers who work for companies, people like yourself. It's only as the industry works together that we have any real significance. If I walked in and started to talk to people, and said, "Here I am, I represent the Association of National Advertisers," that would mean nothing unless there was really some meat to that, and that the companies that we represented at that time actually meant business and were in line with our views. So it's a group effort. And when there's a group effort, we've been quite successful. But the past is not necessarily, as they say about stock, that predict what will happen in the future. So let's keep working together.
There you go. I will conclude finally here with one reaction to that. And that is, in my experience in the career I've had, is that group efforts don't happen without a great leader. And that's where you came in. So compliments to you and your group. Thank you again, Dan, and we'll see each other again soon.
Yes, I look forward to it.
Thank you for joining us on the Dawn to Dusk podcast. You can learn more on building and transitioning a multi-million-dollar law practice in Doug's book, From Dawn to Dusk, How to Build a Multi-Million-Dollar Law Practice and Then Give It Away. If you're interested in working with Doug, suggesting future guests, or have questions you'd like Doug to ask guests in upcoming episodes, reach out to him at douglas.wood@wood.law or visit his website at dawntodusk.wood.law. And if you enjoyed the podcast, don't forget to subscribe and share it with your peers. Until next time, we appreciate your viewership.